Two legends, two fights, one rivalry that changed what people thought a real fight could even look like. At UFC 1, Ken Shamrock was the terrifying athlete people expected to run through the tournament. Royce Gracie was the skinny Brazilian in a gi, walking into a cage full of bigger men and bringing a style most of the American audience barely understood. Then 57 seconds later, everything flipped. Royce submitted Shamrock so fast that the loss became part of Ken's identity. But the real story is not just that first finish. The real story is what happened when Shamrock came back 2 years, because at UFC 5, these two did not give fans another quick submission. They gave them 36 minutes of pressure, frustration, exhaustion, and controversy. One fight made Royce look untouchable. The rematch made the entire sport start asking harder questions. This is Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie. And this rivalry did not just build two Hall of Fame legacies, it helped build the UFC. Start with the setup. In 1993, the UFC was not the clean, regulated machine fans know now. There were no modern weight classes, no standard gloves, no polished round structure. The whole pitch was simple and dangerous. Put different styles in the same cage and find out what works. That is why Royce Gracie was such a perfect weapon for the Gracie family. He did not look like the biggest man in the room. He did not need to. Royce was the proof of concept. If Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu could let him be heavier strikers, wrestlers, and tough men under pressure, then the entire martial arts world had to pay attention. Ken Shamrock represented the nightmare version of the opposite side. He was not just a striker who had never grappled. He was not just a bodybuilder with attitude. Ken had wrestling, submission experience, pancrase seasoning, and the kind of presence that made people believe the nickname before he even fought. The world's most dangerous man was not subtle branding. In that era, it felt possible. At UFC 1, Shamrock had already shown why he was dangerous. He beat Patrick Smith with a heel hook in the quarterfinal, and that finish mattered because it proved Ken understood submission danger in a way most of the field did not. So when Shamrock met Royce in the semifinal, the matchup had real tension. This was not simply jiu-jitsu against ignorance. This was Royce facing one of the only men in the bracket who had a legitimate submission vocabulary of his own. And that is what makes the first fight so shocking. Ken comes forward with power and confidence, but Royce closes distance and gets to the kind of battle he wants. In a modern replay, you can see how quickly the fight stops being about muscles, posture, and intimidation. It becomes about grips, angles, hips, and neck position. Shamrock is strong. Royce is calm. Ken tries to solve the problem with athletic urgency. Royce keeps turning the position into a trap. Then the choke is there. Official records list the UFC 1 finish as a submission at 57 seconds. Depending on the result page, you will see it described as a rear naked choke or a lapel choke, which is one of the details people still argue about. But the important part is not the label. The important part is that Ken tapped. The referee did not immediately understand the tap, and Shamrock had to acknowledge that the fight was over. That moment is brutal, because it attacks the exact thing Shamrock was selling: danger, confidence, intimidation. He did not get outclassed over 20 minutes. He did not lose after a war. He got caught in under a minute by a man who looked like he should not be able to bully him. That is why the first fight still works as a viral clip. It is not just a submission. It is a magic trick with consequences. The big scary shoot fighter enters the cage. The calm jiu-jitsu specialist disappears into the clinch. Then the fight is over before the crowd has fully processed what happened. For Royce, that night became the launch pad. He went on to win the tournament, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu exploded into the consciousness of American fight fans. Suddenly, every striker had to ask the question that ruined so many early UFC game plans. What happened to Shamrock? The loss was not the end. It became fuel. That is the part that makes this rivalry better than a one-night upset. Ken did not simply say, well, Royce was better, and move on. He studied the problem. He understood that the first fight had been too fast to show the full truth. If he could get another chance, he believed he could change the equation. 2 years later, UFC 5 gave him that chance. The rematch was billed as a super fight, and it felt massive for the time. Royce was the face of the Gracie revolution. Shamrock was the dangerous contender who'd been embarrassed once and had every reason to make the second meeting ugly. Fans wanted closure. They wanted to know if the first result was proof, or if Ken had simply made one terrible mistake. The second fight starts with a different energy. Shamrock is more cautious. Royce is still Royce, but the surprise factor is not the same. Ken knows he cannot recklessly chase a finish and give Royce the exact openings he needs. So Shamrock chooses control. That is the key to UFC 5. It is not the wildest fight. It is not the cleanest fight. It is not the prettiest fight to explain to a casual fan. But strategically, it is one of the most important early UFC fights because Ken shows that the Gracie system can be slowed down, smothered, and neutralized if you understand what you are trying to avoid. He gets on top. He keeps pressure. He refuses to dive into obvious submission traps. He makes Royce carry his weight and fight from guard for long stretches. The crowd wanted chaos, but Shamrock was fighting the memory of the first loss. He was not there to entertain Royce's best positions. He was there to make sure the first fight did not happen again. Royce, meanwhile, shows why he was still so hard to beat. Even when he is not dominating, he is calm enough to survive. He keeps Ken locked in the kind of slow, draining battle that makes every mistake feel expensive. He does not. That creates a strange tension. Shamrock looks like he is controlling the geography of the fight, but Royce keeps making the top position feel risky. Ken is winning the physical pressure battle. Royce is keeping the submission threat alive. And the minutes keep stacking. 10 minutes, 15, 20, 30. At a certain point, the fight becomes less about highlight technique and more about stubbornness. You can see fatigue change the pace. You can see both men running out of clean answers. The crowd reaction shifts because early UFC fans were conditioned to expect violent finishes, not long tactical stalemates. Then the strangest part, there are no judges to give anyone a decision. After 36 minutes, Shamrock vs. Gracie 2 ends in a draw. Officially, that is the result. Emotionally, it is a mess. Royce fans can point to survival, composure, and the first fight. Shamrock fans can point to control, pressure, and the fact that Royce could not submit him this time. That split is exactly why the rematch matters. The first fight answered a simple question. Can Royce Gracie beat Ken Shamrock? Yes, and fast. The second fight asked a better question. What happens when the opponent learns from the first loss? That answer was much more complicated, and it pushed MMA forward. Because the UFC could not stay in a world where a fight like that ended with no official judgment. Fans needed outcomes. Fighters needed scoring criteria. Promoters needed structure. Shamrock and Gracie did not solve all of that by themselves, but their draw exposed the problem in front of everyone. This is why calling the UFC 5 fight boring misses the point. It may not be the easiest watch, but it is a blueprint moment. Ken showed the value of top control, submission awareness, and anti-jiu-jitsu discipline. Royce showed the value of guard retention, composure, and making a stronger opponent afraid to take reckless risks. Modern MMA lives in that tension. Every time a wrestler sits in guard and carefully avoids an armbar, you can see a little of this fight. Every time a grappler keeps an opponent cautious without landing a finish, you can see a little of Royce. Every time fans argue whether control should beat submission threat, you can hear the echo of Shamrock vs. Gracie 2. And then there is the legacy between the men themselves. Royce became the symbol of the first UFC revolution. He proved that a smaller fighter with elite grappling could embarrass larger opponents who did not understand the ground. Shamrock became the symbol of the counter-revolution. He was one of the first stars to show that jiu-jitsu was not magic if the opponent adapted, trained, and refused to panic. Their third fight came much later at Bellator 49 in 2016, and it ended in controversy, with Royce winning by TKO after a sequence Shamrock disputed. So, Who won the rivalry? If you care about official wins, Royce has the cleaner answer. He got the UFC 1 submission, and the UFC 5 rematch is listed as a draw. If you care about evolution, the answer gets harder. Shamrock losing in 57 seconds, then coming back and forcing a 36-minute stalemate is one of the clearest before and after examples in early MMA history. That is my hot take. The draw might be more important than the submission. The first fight made Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu famous. The second fight made everyone realize the sport was going to evolve. Royce could still survive. Ken could still adapt. Neither man could freeze the game in place. That is why Shamrock vs. Gracie belongs in every early UFC conversation. It has the shock clip. It has the revenge story. It has the controversial result. It has the style clash. And most importantly, it shows the exact moment when the UFC started moving from one-night spectacle toward a real tactical sport. So drop it in the comments. Did Royce win the rivalry because he got the finish? Or did Shamrock prove more by surviving and neutralizing him at UFC 5? And if you want more raw, early UFC breakdowns, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Next episode, we keep going through the legends, rivalries, and fights that built the sport before the modern rulebook cleaned everything up.